Hello, everybody. I'm your host, Zenitsu, and you're listening to the Digi Talks podcast, the show that covers various topics from news to meta developments and everything in between for the fine folks who love the Digimon trading card game. Just as a quick reminder, I do stream this live over on twitch.tv/Zenitsu, usually on Tuesday nights, and it also gets uploaded as a YouTube video under the channel of Zenitsu, as well as being on various other podcasting platforms like Spotify for your viewing and listening pleasure. Please feel free to leave a rating, like, follow, subscribe, and whatever, depending on the platform that you're listening on, to try to help support the podcast. So today I am back with my good old friend Mark, and we're going to be taking a look and talking about starter products. So starter products is a broad term, basically just starter decks and entry level, booster boxes or stuff to get people into the game. This also could be demo decks and whatever. Just, figuring out a way to have the lowest barrier of entry so players can actually, start the game. But before we get into that conversation, we have metadata to look for, and we also have a question of the week. So this question of the week is going to be, how often do you think starter products like starter decks and entry-level boosters should be released? So do you have an answer to that question, Mark?
I would say it kind of depends on the game, depending on how much product is coming out, but I'd say like at least every other set would be my preference.
Every other set, so like if you're going with the average 4 sets a year, that's about twice a year then?
Yeah.
Okay, I think the answer kind of is similar to what you said in my perspective. Like I come from Magic. That's one of the core games that I came from. And they used to have really good starter product releases. They would have basically something every main set, and right now they kind of do for Commander. And they only do like challenger decks and whatever once a year. But I really liked every single set having something for new players to jump into. But Magic also had like core sets where it was a standard booster that basically gave you a whole bunch of like the generic staples that you're probably going to be using for the standard environment, and that was a booster box designed to lower the barrier to entry. And I liked just those ideas. I think Magic obviously went a little too crazy and too far with it, burnt themselves out on it, and then saw that it wasn't doing well because they burnt everyone out on it, and then backpedaled. But that's a them problem rather than a like product problem.
Yeah, because it used to be the Commander was a once a year release where there's like, oh hey, we're putting out 5 new Commander decks, and that's all we're doing for Commander, specifically Commander. And then you had all of your normal releases for the normal sets. And I remember back when I started, they were doing the I'm blanking on the names, but they are basically like the 2 deck combos.
The dual
Was
decks?
that referred the dual deck? Yeah, the dual decks. Thank you. They did the dual decks, which I thought that would be a really good concept for somebody who wants to just get into Magic, because it's like, oh hey, you just buy this and you literally take one deck, you hand a deck to another guy, your friend, and it's like you're good to go. One product and you're set.
Yeah,
But
and I
now it's
know.
like,
Yeah, now it's they do commander decks every single set, and they barely do any other format support in terms of like starter products.
yeah, now it's like you get 2 or 4 commander decks per release, and uh, to be fair, Magic has changed how they do a ton of stuff. I mean, it used to be back in the day you had like when you got into a new block, it's like, okay, well here's the main set for the block, and here's your 2 supporting sets for the block, and then it became, oh well, here's the main set for the block, and here's like a pseudo supporting set slash main set support. I don't know, we're doing 2 sets of block kind of
Yeah,
thing.
part two.
And now it's basically like, hey, we're just doing one-offs. Here's the set. There's going to be no continuation, but we might revisit it in the future.
Which they barely have, and Wizards right now, story wise, they've kind of burnt almost all their bridges and wrapped them all up. So they kind of worked themselves into a corner. But they're the game that's in the most unique position when it comes to that. But I know other games like Pokemon and Vanguard and just, card games from other companies, they generally do pretty decent on making sure to try to have entry level products relatively available and have them be kind of relevant. I know, like, we're going to get too far into the discussion. We'll save this for the actual conversation. But, like, I generally think having at least something every set is good to keep interest and always make sure there's an entry point into the game rather than, oh, you missed this wave of starter decks, therefore it's better to just wait for the next wave of starter decks. That's a really poor excuse in my perspective, because we've had that happen in Digimon before where it's just like, oh, you missed the advanced deck. Well, they're kind of harder to get because Bandai prints only to demand, so or they don't print to demand, I mean. So once they're done, they're done. So you're just better off waiting for the next one, which could be 2-3 months down the line, and that kind of sucks. Granted, we still have other older starter decks, but I digress. If you want to get the newest, latest, hottest stuff, sometimes that's not the most feasible. But
I think your statement was correct. They print to demand. They look at the pre-orders that came in. They said, we're printing that many.
Yeah, I'm thinking like Wizards print to demand, where it's just like, oh, they'll constantly always be printing it as long as there's demand for it.
Yes.
Bandai's print to demand is, we're going to have this one wave of interest. You have this pre-order period, and then after that, there's no more demand for it, right? So we're just not going to print anything past our buffer percentage, which has its pros and has its cons. It's smart business-wise, but does it sometimes piss the players off.
Well, before we get too deep into that, why don't we go ahead and go over the statistics?
Yeah. So I got some more metadata. We have 2 events. One is a smaller event. This is the PPG EX6 Webcam Win-A-Case tournament, which actually is a split-a-case tournament. So all of the prizing is in top 8, and then it's a trickle down. So it's like first place got 4 boxes, which is still pretty good because EX6 is very hot right now. Probably too hot in my perspective. For what the product is. But as far as top 8 goes, we have Demon Lords taking first, Numemon taking second, Mirage taking third, Fenry Lugamon taking fourth, Ragnarlordmon in fifth, Tyrant Kabuterimon in sixth, Ragnarlord again in seventh, and in eighth it was Imperial. This was 53 players, so that's like, 6 rounds if my math is correct? Which is a decent number of rounds, but it's not like a huge event. And as far as what's actually breaking into the meta this event, it's Ragnarlordmon. So I could just show you the Ragnarlordmon builds real quick, because there's 2 of them. Everything else really didn't change and is already well known and established. So you could see some commonalities between the Ragnarlordmon lists. It's mostly spoilers, just using the new stuff, and a tiny bit of the old stuff, and a couple of tech cards. So for the most part, that's it. You just get EX6, subsidize it with some older stuff and tech, and boom, the deck is done. Very easy. But it has lots of answers and outs and good protection, which is why it can do well. It struggles sometimes in the consistency department, just making sure it can find all of its parts and pieces. And after you play Ragnarlordmon Ace, sometimes you can kind of just fizzle on, pressure and damage. And then if your protections are outed, then the entire deck just falls apart on its face. So that's always fun. The one thing that I'm noticing is both of them are not actually using the option that is putting like the added protection to the deck to try to at least keep a Digimon around in case they do out your main stack when the protections fall off. So that's definitely something interesting to note, is both of these lists are not using that. But congratulations to all of the players. It's nice to see a pretty diverse spread of decks, even though the majority of them we've already seen before. And then as far as the big event, we have an Ultimate Cup. So this is the Play TCG July Ultimate Cup. As far as top 16 breakdowns, it goes as follows. We have 6 Numemon, 3 Yellow Vaccine Armors, 3 7 Great Demon Lords, 1 Mirage, 1 Blue Flare, 1 Dorbic OTK, and 1 Imperial. So the Dorbic is the only like real newcomer, and it's a very spicy list that I'll flash up in a minute. But as far as what actually took first, it was Mirage. Second place was Numemon. Third place was Yellow Vaccine. Fourth place was 7 Great Demon Lords. Fifth was Numemon. Sixth was also Numemon. Seventh was Blue Flare. Eighth was Numemon. Ninth was 7 Great Demon Lords. 10th was Numemon. 11th was the Dorbic. 12th was 7 Great Demon Lords, followed by 13th with Yellow Vaccine as well as 14th. Then we got Numemon in 15th and Imperial all the way down there at 16th. So as far as what the Dorbicmon deck is doing, it is actually a Ragnalord deck in disguise as Dorbicmon. So it's basically just trying to line up one super big stack using X antibodies and then using like Oriumon just to try to make your stack even bigger. So that way when you line up your DNA play, you hard play Dorbicmon, throw more things underneath, and then you just DNA into Ragnalordmon and then just win on the spot because he should have enough sources to just straight up burn all of the opponent's security, and then because he has Blitz, he just attacks for game. So it doesn't even matter if you pass the memory over onto the opponent's side, he's just going to auto-win you the game as long as they're unable to stop the Ragnalordmon. And the key card that's actually making this deck kind of function is Metal Cannon, because you just use your X antibody stuff to just make, again, a really huge stack, and then you Metal Cannon to just draw a whole bunch of cards. Like, you probably will draw, like, what? So we got 1 egg, 1 level 3, 2... Yeah, ideally 2 level 4s, 2 level 5s, you're level 6, so you're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, at least 7 cards in your source. So for 2 memory, draw 7, that's pretty good. On top of drawing on the way up, so you do have that added consistency there. And then you got like your stereotypical digging package between defense training and memory boost. But the rest of these cards just kind of don't really matter. They just are cards to play with either X Antibody or Dorbicmon, so that way you could Ragna. And I think that's pretty spicy that this is able to do well. But OTK decks, as long as they're competent, they'll always be good. Like, that's just the rule of OTK. That's why Mirage is good, because it's one of the best OTK decks, and that's why Fenrir is still good, because, again, it's just another OTK deck. It doesn't really matter what the opponent is doing as long as you're doing what they're doing. As long as you're keeping up and you're able to get to your game plan, which is kind of where Blue Flares is right now also, because they're still using the Greymon, in the Mailbird, so that way you have security attack jamming, and then you get multiple checks, so not bad. This deck is actually running the BT14 War Greymon, so that way you could evolve it off of the metal and try to get more checks that way, because he gives himself security attack plus. So you have 2 different level 6s that you could go into, and then if you just leave it up, you have Vike to try to like counterplay against the opponent along with Zudo. So it's a solid list. Don't discount it. This isn't running 8 Ukamon like the other list that we saw top. So you don't need all 8. You just need enough rookies to be able to see your stuff, and then you just go. So yeah. Outside of that, all of the other lists we've kind of already known. If anyone's actually curious on the current state of the meta, I did make a post about it where realistically the meta has 6 decks. And that is Magnamon, Yellow Vaccine Armor, Numemon, Imperial, Mirage, and 7 Great Demon Lord. Those are obviously the decks that are performing the best right now. Demon Lords is the only new entry that's actually making any kind of waves. So, yeah, that's the current state of the meta. What can I say? It really didn't change. We just got 1 new deck from the new set. And it looks like we're going to be stuck like this for a hot minute until BT 17 comes out, which I think is like in a month or a month and a half. So, hooray! We get to see nothing change. And if anyone's wondering, Numemon, yes, is the top deck. He's right now a third of the meta in terms of how strong he is in comparison to the other decks. So that's always fun. That Numemon is just that good. I did top with Numemon, so I kind of like wanted to understand where Numemon's strengths and weaknesses are, and it's kind of crazy where it is. But I'll save that for a potential video if I end up actually covering my top 8 win with Numemon that got me my invite. But now, back to the actual topic, now that the boring stuff is over. I guess some people might find the meta stuff to be important and interesting. I just find it boring right now because nothing's really changing. So, starter deck products. This shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, but Digimon, to me, actually has a lack of starter deck products. It feels like we need more, and Bandai could do more. I say this because looking at some of Bandai's other card games, like One Piece, they already have more starter decks than we do, both planned and released. And I think that's criminal. They also had more demo decks than we did. And I think like demo decks is a huge thing. Right now they're doing like the Imperial starter deck, or like demo decks, which is basically the Imperial starter deck, which I think is like good, but I think they should do that more often. So Mark, you're used to other card games, and I know we're both kind of dabbling a little bit into Pokemon, but I think Pokemon's got some like really good starter deck design. Like, we could start going into starter deck design in terms of like, obviously a starter deck should obviously be something that people want to get started in the game to learn all of the basics and the cores. But when it comes to starter deck design, there's good starter decks and there's bad starter decks.
Oh, for sure. I mean, a lot of times, you know, the starter deck, you don't want it to be overcomplicated. You want it to cover a wide breadth of mechanics so that the players can get exposed to a multitude of different things that they will run into throughout, getting deeper into whatever card game they're playing, whether it's, Digimon, One Piece, Magic, Pokemon, whatever. You want a good variety of mechanics that the player can play with and learn how do these mechanics interact with the rules of the game and all of that jazz. The problem is generally is that you don't want to have some of the really overcomplicated cards in the starter decks. So you try not to make them like super juiced, but at the same time, you still want the starter decks to feel like if I literally just bought this trial deck or starter deck or whatever this starting product may be that is a complete deck, and I said, I'm going to go play in a tournament, let's see how it goes. Reasonably speaking, I would expect somebody in a like 7 round tournament with a starter deck, I feel like they should at least be able to take 2 matches, even against some of the meta stuff. It doesn't have to be like the hardcore meta stuff because it'll probably wipe it, but generally speaking, it has the capacity to hold up against the more constructed decks, which is also a good another good thing that I do like about a lot of starter decks is generally there is some pretty good stuff that gets put in them to the point where even I know with my experience in playing Weiss, there's usually at least 1 or 2 cards in any set's trial decks that are almost an absolute must for that set's meta builds, which is a good way to incentivize your existing player base to buy that starting product, but it's also good because it gives those players that are new to the game that are coming into it, they're not holding a deck that's just complete garbage, and once they kind of learn how to play the game and they understand the more meta side, the more constructed side, they're like, well, there's nothing in this deck that is literally playable. Why did I even buy it? Outside of wanting to learn the game.
Yeah, and right now with Digimon, a lot of starter decks are kind of in that secondary territory where it's just like, why am I even wasting my money on this? Because, like I kind of alluded to before, right now the current demo deck that probably is going to be at Gen Con and that Bandai has been using for probably at least 6 months, is the Imperial Dramon demo deck, which is basically the majority of the good cards from the Imperial Dramon starter deck and the good cards from BT12, with a couple of, like, unique staples like Ukamon and Louis thrown into the mix, and Davis and Vmon. So that way it actually makes players want to try out the game if they know that's meta. And I feel like having those more meta cards in trial decks is a very weird decision, because I think that would be something like more akin to what you would put into a demo deck, or not a demo deck, into an actual starter deck. So like if they were to have remade the Imperial starter deck, the demo deck is basically what we should have gotten. Maybe a couple of like new spicy inclusions as well. But the idea is to obviously get players into the game, and I feel like certain decks don't age very well. Like the Ragnar Lordmon starter deck, like sure it has a couple of pieces for Ragnar right now, but when I was tuning up that deck because my brother was interested in it, he basically like stopped as I was unsleeving almost everything, and he's just like, so you're throwing away basically the whole deck? And I'm just like, no, we're keeping one card from it. And he looks at me and he's just like, really? One card? And that's the BT or starter deck Bryway Ludramon, because that's right now the best card in the starter deck. And I feel like that's a little bit unfortunate that the whole starter deck was generally supposed to be what you play with, and now that the upgrades came out, you're basically replacing almost the entire deck. And there's decks that are even worse than that, like the Intro to Black deck that we got from year one. Basically garbage. Almost nothing from that deck is anywhere near relevant, versus some of the other decks where at least it has still one or two cards that remain relevant. Yellow has the basic yellow starter deck also is pretty bad, because Patamon's like the best thing from it, and he's not seeing a whole lot of play. After we begged them for some reprints of that card. But yeah, like starter decks generally should have a slew of different mechanics to be able to get players into the game, but also feel rewarding for playing the game because the deck is actually somewhat functional. And I almost feel really bad for anyone who bought into the Wolf of Friendship and Dragon of Courage, because like, yeah, they have a couple of good cards here and there, but as functional decks, they're just garbage. They're not good enough anymore. And that's why Bandai created advanced decks, is because that's the more powerful starter deck, but you still need to buy 2 copies of it, because I don't remember exactly what the rules are for each game in terms of starter decks, because I know with Yu-Gi-Oh! It's the 3-deck rule, and in Bandai games it's the 2-deck rule. Is it 2-deck rule in Bushi as well?
2-deck rule in what capacity? I'm just not following.
Oh, just how many starter decks to get a playset of every card in the deck, because what companies will like to do is just exclude, like, having their best cards be 4-ofs in the starter deck so that you actually need.
Okay, yeah, then it's 2 decks.
Okay, yeah, I think most people, or like most companies, it's the 2-deck rule. Because I know even with like Magic, they try to make you do the 1 or 2, the 2 or 3 deck rule. Sometimes even 4 decks, because they'll have like a random one-off. But you just buy the singles half the time with Magic, because that game's just too big. And players and their product is just too expensive. But that's another thing to talk about, is like price point. Because right now advanced decks are about $30, which are supposedly meta ready out of the box. Spoiler, they're not, but they're close. And then you got starter decks, which are the actual like low level entry level product that usually run you about $12. And I know in One Piece they have something even below that, where it's like $8 for like just something that's barely even playable. So And then yeah, Digimon, like I said, they don't really have any dedicated set that's like a good entry point into the game.
Well, and on the
Which
topic of, oh, go ahead and finish your thought.
which I would like to see more of, just not an RB1 situation because having a reprint set is great. Don't get me wrong. It's just the way they treated that set was god awful and it ruined the product and it probably damaged the game as a whole. And we're now seeing the ramifications of the damage that RB1 has caused.
Well, on the topic of entry level price point, I can definitely see things kind of going, kind of can go both ways. On the one hand, if you have that $12 entry deck or $10 entry deck or what have you, somebody picks it up, wants to learn the game, plays around with the deck a little bit, decides, this game really isn't for me. I'm only out $10. It's not that it's not that big of a hit to the pocketbook, you know, not a problem. But then I also see the other side of it where you're talking like generally, the entry level decks, those trial decks, what have you, generally don't have a lot of the really hot meta stuff that you would see in, heavy constructed play. So that player who spent $10 on that starter deck was like, "Hey, I want to dig deeper into this." And it's like, "Oh crap. I just bought a $10 deck that I'm literally going to use absolutely nothing out of. This kind of feels bad because I kind of got this starter deck on the assumption of, hey, there's going to be some stuff in here, and I can put some stuff from the box sets into this and make an improvement. But in the example that you gave earlier, where it's like, oh yeah, I'm literally keeping one card out of this deck, and everything else is getting replaced. As a new player, it's like, ouch. I don't even know why I bothered buying this deck at this point.
Right. When a lot of like buying singles at this point in time is like no real big deal or like that strange of an idea or concept. I know like back then like 10, 20 years ago that was like, "Oh my god, I could just buy the single of the card because somebody opened up a bunch of the starter decks and they're selling just the good card from it." Like sign me up. That makes it way more palatable because right now, I feel like right now, specifically with the latest advanced deck, they did the community such a big dirty. So the latest advanced deck is Double Typhoon. It's not a bad deck. I'm going to flat out say it has some really strong and powerful cards that are used in a wide variety of decks because the little Terriermon engine that they printed for it is actually really good. The only problem is usually the idea of a starter deck is a start. It's the entry point. Granted, advanced decks for Digimon is supposed to be the next level up, where it's a entry point into competitive Digimon. And usually when you're starting off, that's the start. It's you're at ground zero, but they want you to upgrade it. So obviously they'll either leave cards out if they're getting reprinted, or they will print cards in either one set above or one set below when the starter deck came out to be able to entice players to, hey, here's your starter deck. If you want, you could go to the store and reasonably find the packs or booster boxes that help enhance the starter deck. It's just the problem with the Terriermon Double Typhoon deck is the best enhancements are higher rarity cards. So, like, that's a huge disservice for, like, an entry point where it's just like, yeah, so in order to start playing professional Digimon, I'm just going to label it as, like, professional or competitive, buy this $30 starter deck. By the way, you need 2 of that. Now you're down $60. And then you also need 4 of the secret rare. That's $40 each. So there's another $240. So here's a $300 starting point. That turns people off more than a $10 starting point with maybe $20 upgrades. Like that's a little bit of a difference in terms of what you're asking out of the players. And I get it, it's an advanced deck, but at the same time, if that's what's available and what people are gravitating to, that's just a huge disservice. I don't know if any other card games like pull that big of a rug underneath their players. I'm pretty sure some of them do. Like Yu-Gi-Oh probably is really bad at it, but Yu-Gi-Oh just has its own separate problems in general.
Well, I was gonna say I don't know. I don't know with a lot of other games, but on the point of yeah, it feels like a major disservice because it's just like, oh hey, you decided you want to get competitive. All right, just be prepared to drop like $300. And I know back when I was still playing Magic standard format for Magic, I mean that was just kind of the unfortunate reality of like any competitive standard deck. It's just like, oh, I just want to throw something together that's not too terrible. So I threw together. It was probably about $100 deck. And it's like, I can't even tell you how much I am disgusted by the thought of black rats or mono black rats now because that was the most egregious deck in standard. Everybody was running the dang thing, and I just got so sick and tired of seeing it. And I was just like, what is the price point for this deck currently? Probably is a little higher because it's the hardcore meta deck and everybody wants it. But like the price point for that deck was easily at the time, I want to say it was about $500. And it's like, yeah, I don't expect most new players that want to pick up the game are going to just be like, yeah, I'm going to drop like $500 in singles to throw this deck together. So it definitely doesn't feel good as a new player, but it does kind of introduce players to the reality of how competitive kind of is in a sense. Like if you want to make these competitive decks, generally you're going to be spending a fair bit of money to do it. Now, I'm not saying that's true for every deck because, there's definitely some really good budget meta decks. I mean, you could easily throw together a $100 deck in Digimon and be like, yeah, this deck is like almost tier one. It's
I
great.
mean, yeah, like Mirage, just as an example, it's one of the top five decks, and you could easily build it for less than $100 or just around that $100 mark. So it's just like you look at spending $300 because you want to play Terriermon. That's borderline tier two or tier three at this point. In terms of like actually being competitive, it's not that great. It's good. It's not insane. Um, but you look at something like Mirage or even Red Hybrids, and those are $100 decks. You could even go like a step backwards in time. You could have built Hunters or you could have built Crosshearts for like $50 for a tier one meta competitive deck. And that was like crazy. To and those decks didn't have starter decks. So like it really puts into perspective like why am I wasting my time with starter decks when, the decks that you're giving me inside the set, if I literally just buy the singles, I could just buy a competitive deck that's cheaper than a starter deck. Sure, it won't have the rule books, it won't have like some of the other things that starter decks come with, reminder cards, and whatnot. But in terms of like a actual starting point, at this point, I would probably say to people, like, don't waste your time with starter decks for Digimon because they're, most of the time, barely worth it. And if they are, you're going to have to spend a lot of money to be able to upgrade it into something competitive. Like, they butchered the Wolf of Friendship starter deck, which was supposed to be a good entry point into Purple Garurumon, but because EX5, which was the set to upgrade it, had too many cards banned and limited, it really hurt the viability of that type of strategy to have a good starter deck with a set that comes out relatively recent that upgrades it. And don't even get me started about Dragon of Courage because those are the actual last starter decks we had that were released like almost a year ago at this point, which is crazy because it's like we do two starter decks a year. One's an advanced deck and one's an actual starter deck. And I don't think that's good enough in my perspective. Because you look at the Dragon of Courage and, like, not a lot of cards are played from it. A couple are. Don't get me wrong. Some of them are pretty decent. But in terms of a deck, it's not even meta competitive. It's nowhere even meta relevant because a lot of the best Agumon stuff is red, not black. And this is trying to push you to be more black based, but black based was proven not to work. Where at least with Garurumon and purple based, because the new cards came out, that made it more relevant of an idea to toy with.
Oh, that's a good point that I was hoping to move to in the discussion is what do you feel is a good amount of starter or intro decks to put out there? Because I certainly agree, like you're not too far off when it's you could say, hey, why bother with this $10 starter deck when, here's a list, go hit TCG player up. You can literally put this pseudo tier one high tier two deck together for $50. So why wouldn't you? But at the same time, one thing that I really enjoy about starter decks is when there is a plethora or a variety of them, because not everybody is going to pick a deck up and be like, oh yeah, this is definitely the deck that I want to play. I just absolutely love this play style. This deck is literally me. How many times do you have the exact opposite where somebody picks up a deck, they play it, and like, I absolutely hate this. I don't like any of the mechanics that this deck is functioning on. I don't like the style that the deck is trying to push. What are my other options? And I mean, that's a nice thing when you have a good plethora of, like maybe 4 starter decks, and it's like, hey, here's your like standard rush for this game. Here's your standard control. Here's kind of your standard mid range. Here's your like goofy off the wall stuff, because we know every game has it, despite the fact that it's usually never good. But it really throws people off their game when they run into the that kind of wacky nonsense, because it's like, oh crap, now it's throwing my entire game into disarray. And there's a lot of people that like that. It might not be a great deck, but all of a sudden you're adding new elements to the gameplay where it's like, oh well, now I don't have to necessarily respond to what my opponent's doing. They have to respond to me. Or, oh hey, I'm just rushing face. This feels good because now my opponent has to respond to me. But then you also have the players that are like, I don't want to have to be putting, a bunch of pressure on. I'm going to wait for my opponent to do something. And when they do something I don't like, I'm going to tell them no. And then they have to figure out what to do about it.
Yeah, so as far as looking at how Digimon functions as a game, to actually answer how many starter decks we should reasonably get, that's a little bit harder. I honestly think one starter deck per booster set would be ideal. We are going to exclude EX sets because EX sets supposedly are kind of starter products. They're like the Digimon-esque equivalent to starter product, where the idea is there's a whole bunch of complete or semi-complete packages inside of them, so that way you just invest in that set to be able to build 1 or 2 decks out of. EX6 being the latest one, obviously Ragnalordmon is 90% there. Like, you don't need that much extra stuff outside of what's in the new set in order to be able to build that deck. Then you have 7 Great Demon Lords, which obviously is the premier deck, so that's going to be a little bit more on the expensive side to build because of the multiple different supers and secrets that it needs. But if you're only buying EX6 out of like maybe 4 booster boxes or even 2 booster boxes with some good luck, you should reasonably be able to build the Demon Lords deck, because that's where my brother is at right now. Is he just built Demon Lords out of literally 2 booster boxes, and the only thing he's realistically missing is 1 Lucimon Chaos Mode, the new one, and he has pretty much almost everything else. Sure, the deck is obviously better with a couple of supplemented cards in it to further enhance what it's doing. What deck isn't? But in terms of, like, actually as a start, he just bought a couple of booster boxes of EX6, and now he has a meta-competitive deck, for the most part. Sure, I'm over-exaggerating on things a little bit, but that's what EX sets do. So I think, honestly, outside of EX sets, have 1 starter deck or 2 starter decks per booster box, I think is recommended. For the way Digimon is, probably 1, just because you don't want to overdo it, as we learned with other card games, that sometimes too much product is not a good thing. But at least having 1 to directly upgrade. So, like, imagine a world where we already know that Liberators is a thing. We're getting the Liberators starter decks around the same time as BT17 and EX7. EX7 is supposed to be the upgrade to the Liberator starter decks more directly. But, like, what I would like to see going forward into Block 4 is each set has a Liberator starter deck. So we already know with Special Booster 1. Or not 1.0, 2.0, we're going to have Fanbimon. So why not just have a Fanby starter deck? Then when Special Booster 2.0 comes out, which is combining some of BT 18 and 19, then you just buy the starter deck, buy into that booster, and you should reasonably be able to put Fanbimon together. Then the set afterward could 2.5 could be V and Three Musketeers, or in the lore, V has a couple of other different decks, so what's not to say you can't just make, hey, here's this Three Musketeer V deck, and here's this Undead V deck, or Dark Animal V deck, or whatever. So I like the idea of having at least one starter deck that's going to be upgrading with the set, because the set does try to premiere some different elements based on Digimon's set design, because they'll have like an overarching like block design. So it's like Block 4 is going to be all about Liberators. So every single set is going to have something Liberators in it as the big overarching theme. And then each set after, like, inside will also have the sub support for whatever the main theme of each of the individual boosters are. We already know BT18 is Frontiers with more hybrid stuff. So that's just the example on why I think like one starter deck should be a good idea. Because imagine if we had like a Lugomon starter deck at the beginning of Block 3. So it's like we get Block 3, that's Seekers. We get a Lugomon starter deck, that's cool. Then, you know, he actually has cards to upgrade him. And then throughout the rest of the season or cycle, or block, then he just gets more and more support stemming from the starter deck and his initial base product.
Well, that would go with your earlier statement where you felt like releasing more consistently is better than releasing like in big chunks. Because I guess while you were saying that, I was thinking in my head like, well, why don't they do something like, let's release like a deck for each of the colors at the start of the year, and then with each new set that we release, why don't we introduce a new starter deck? But then, that kind of got me things like, well, that might be a little too much starter product, especially if, you're also throwing into the mix like, oh, hey, we're adding in a challenger deck with every other set, or, something to that effect. But
yeah, I know One Piece right now, they're about to basically get the second wave of like true intro decks where it's teaching you the themes and concepts of each of their colors. And there's 6 of them on top of all of the other starter decks that they've had already. So like I don't necessarily think that's too far out of the question, where it's just like you have like a core set of starter decks that's going to be coming out once a year that introduces the themes of each of the color, acting as the true starting point. And then after that, probably each set will have a more dedicated starter deck. So there's 4 sets out of the year. The first set has 6. Then you have the next set, which will have 1. And then by the end, you'll have 9 starter decks. And then the advanced deck will make 10. So I don't necessarily think like that's crazy. 10 starter decks a year might sound crazy, but we already look at One Piece and they're already on starter deck 20 and they're entering their second or third year. They're half of our life. And they already have double, like almost the exact amount of product that we have in terms of starter decks. So it's not out of the question, especially if the game is doing well enough. Obviously, One Piece is doing better than Digimon. This is just a known fact because One Piece is Bandai's love child. They just have a hard-on for it. But Digimon being their second best game in my perspective, in terms of where the current market is. I honestly don't think that 10 starter decks a year is that crazy, considering we already have 7 or 8 booster boxes. No, we have 6 or 7 booster sets a year also. And if that's literally all they're doing, like no additional supplementary side product that we really need to like hardcore invest into, which we really haven't had until literally December, where they have like this little LM booster box, which no one knows what that's going to look like. Um, we really haven't had that many supplemental products. So if they go a little bit harder on starter decks, I don't see that being that big of a deal, especially if it's only lowering the barrier to entry. Because I see this question so much on I'm new to the game, where do I start? And if they start literally, like, if you were a brand new Digimon player that is starting right now and you're looking at starter deck products, I'm sorry, you're kind of SOL because you don't have good options. You either overpay for the Terriermon deck and then you're forced to pay an exuberant amount of money just to upgrade the darn thing, or you buy any starter deck and it's already not worth your money. So it's like this is what spurred the concept, is the fact that like we just don't have a good way for new players to start the game other than just buying booster boxes, which most booster boxes don't contain the ability to actually build decks out of, which again is a foreign concept to a lot of people because just of how Digimon decks are designed. They're designed with the evolutionary line in mind, and if your deck only has one evolutionary line, you can't build anything with that.
Well, and then that kind of goes back to the debate of how good do you make the starter deck? Because obviously you don't want to make, you don't want to put too much high tier, really good stuff in the starter deck. Because, I mean, then you could go into the issue where we talked before, like, hey, what happens when we start adding too many staples? But also, I wonder how it affects the game when super meta relevant cards, like a good chunk of super meta relevant cards, becomes very easily accessible. Because I mean, if I can spend $25 buying 2 starter decks, and of those starter decks, I can put half of them, like 5 play sets of cards into my meta competitive deck. It's like, okay, you're going to see a ton of this, and what kind of effect does that start having on the meta? But at the same time, you don't want them to be completely useless to the point where it's like, okay, well, we have an ungodly amount of starter product now, but it's all worthless,
So
and there's really
that's
no reason anyone should buy it.
Yeah, so that's the where I think the idea of like leveled starter decks come in, where it's like obviously we know we kind of have this between starter decks and advanced decks, but like the 6 core decks that are supposed to be very entry level, I think that should be the very base level where it's like, okay, this is literally to just teach you the core mechanics of the game. They're probably staple wise, there's not going to be too much crazy things, like maybe a good tamer or good option, or just relevantly named Digimon, or like one Digimon with a halfway decent effect. But like the core color starter decks, we've only had once, and I think we definitely are due for them to appear again. And I think that should be the lowest level. Then, kind of going off of what I was saying, where every set has at least a starter deck to go with it, I think that's where you go with the actual like current mid-level starter decks. And then the other end of the spectrum is the once a year advanced deck that will be actually meta viable and competitive and come with all of the good fancy schmancy stuff. Because Bandai likes to make them fully foil and give them sleeves, which is only upping the cost of the starter deck, regardless of the actual quality of the deck in terms of like the card pool. But I think that in terms of staple wise, those probably should go into more of the mid level. So it's just like, oh, here's the Fenry Lugamon starter deck. Just as an example, if we were going with this idea from Block 3, I think that should have something like memory boosts, or that should have something like the training cards inside of it, or something comparable to that if it's not exactly the same thing. So that way, like, hey, there's actually a reason to get this, even though the rest of the cards are going to eventually be phased out. But because of the way Digimon set design is, you get that, you get the BT 14 booster box, and then you're basically good to go with the Lugamon deck. And then you just, oh, BT 15 has a couple new cards. Cool, I'm going to start swapping them out. And that's like the kickoff point. And that's kind of where I think Digimon should be. So it's like with the idea of the Liberator stuff, if we were to have a Fanbimon, like Vespimon and Queen Vespimon idea, that should have like a option card to help with the deck's consistency, give it one full evolution line that's relevant, and then let the set be the second evolution line to complete the deck to make it actually functionable.
Okay, well, it's starting to sound kind of similar to when Amonkhet was a thing in Magic, and I remember there was the Hazoret Challenger deck, which came with I believe it had two copies of Hazoret and
Yeah, it did.
Glorybringer, and basically like a lot of your really high rarity staples for the mono red rush deck, and then it was just a matter of getting the couple of like really getting, it seemed like, mostly the uncommons that you needed for the deck. And I remember that deck being, outside of the Hazards and the Glorybringers, it felt like that deck was quite cheap and very easy to put together.
Yeah, and I definitely think something like Weiss Schwartz and eventually Union Arena, they kind of do starter, like, they're forced to do starter decks the way that they are because of how, the game functions. Because you're not going to say, hey, we're releasing the Mushoku Tensei starter deck alongside of the Jujutsu Kaisen set. Like, it just doesn't make sense. You have to release it simultaneously, and I'm just basically trying to apply that idea to Digimon based on the overarching theme of the year that they generally like to include with Digimon. So that's kind of where I'm taking a lot of my inspiration from, because I don't know that much about Pokemon's starter decks, and Magic kind of killed theirs off for commander decks and everything, which obviously is really good, but right now Magic, the market is like over flooded with commander decks to the point where stores just have too much and they can't get rid of them at all. And like, they don't age very well either, which again creates a problem because now they're forced to put those on sale, which that's making it appealing because now the deck is cheap to be able to pick up and get into. And like, the whole idea is to lower the price to lower the barrier to entry. And Pokemon has a whole bunch of other like starter decks. I'm just Google searching. Like, they have My First Battle, which is looks like a deck that literally is curating its turns. In terms of teaching the core mechanics. Then they have like League Battle decks, which is probably their equivalent of like the more meta competitive decks. And then they just have like normal battle decks. So like, they kind of are doing like that tiered deck system as well, which I think like a lot of companies are doing because that's the smart thing to do. Except for like games like obviously not Jujutsu Kaisen. My head was in Union Arena territory because that's one of the first sets is Jujutsu Kaisen and Weiss Schwartz, where it's just like, okay, you literally buy the starter deck, then you buy into the set, and then you're done, which I think is a very appealing prospect. But at the same time, I know like unless there's a revisit to that IP, that is it. So they kind of need to have somewhere to subsidize it outside of like, hey, here's a little like extra collection thing where it's like 50 cards of just new cards to that IP. But again, that's just introducing more stuff to the IP, which they usually do in post, not on release.
Right. So that definitely is a lot more dependent on the structure of the game because, like you said, you're not going to release, one IP starter deck alongside a different IP's booster box because you can't use the cards cross like that. But an interesting thing that you kind of brought up was Magic completely like turned face on their starter product, and they basically, I'm guessing, the metrics are just like, oh man, Commander is our most popular format. we can make money off of that. Like I mentioned earlier, it used to be Commander product came out for Magic once a year. It wasn't too terribly pricey if I remember. I want to say it was like $40 or $45 for a deck. They came out with 5 decks. They always had, some kind of special theme for the decks for the year. But the great thing about it was is yeah, they were a little on the expensive side, but you almost always got amazing value out of those decks. I mean, you spent $45 for this commander deck, and if you price the cards that are inside of this deck out, you're looking at like at least double, if not more, in value of what it would have been to piece it together piece by piece. But now, like you said, there's such an oversaturation because it seems like with every single set, I mean, like every just normal set that comes out in the past couple of years, there's at least 2 commander decks that come out with it. And then, when they do a bigger release like they did with Modern Horizons 3, there's 4 decks that come out with it. So,
Yeah.
I mean, if there's, if they do, just say they do maybe 2 special releases, that's 8 decks. And if they do 4 normal releases, that's another 8 decks. That's 16 decks a year. And if nobody finds them all that appealing, they're just going to sit there and rot. And then the other thing that you mentioned is I do believe that the newer commander decks do not all of them, but like the normal set ones, the 2 ofs per set, those ones I believe are the ones that have the lower price point. But at the same time, that lower price point has caused the decks to not have as much good generalized value cards in them. So, I mean, then those decks become like, hey, I bought this for 2 cards in the entire deck. Wait, why did I buy it for these 2 cards? Wouldn't I have been better off just buying, singles?
Yeah, there's a very fine line when it comes to actual starter deck design, and like to kind of bring things home, because I think like we hammered out a lot of what we feel like should be a good array of starter product. And like obviously starter decks are important, making sure there's enough in circulation, making sure they're relevant enough when they are in circulation, is all good. Making sure that the set next to it is going to actually be able to upgrade the starter deck is good. Like these are all good elements to have for starter decks, but when it comes to actually looking at starter deck design, obviously you want to have at least one of every card type present to be able to teach them all of the bases. And then depending on the level of starter deck, that's kind of where you go more mechanically deep. So it's just like the bringing back to the Wolf of Friendship and the Dragon of Courage decks. They introduced the ace mechanic, so they threw in an ace Digimon to try to teach that. The advanced deck obviously has an ace Digimon that you're going to be using as well, but it has more complicated options and more complicated effects and abilities that make it more powerful of a deck, obviously, but more meta relevant. And I feel like that's a good direction in order to take starter decks, because like we've had starter decks where they don't introduce all of the card types, and like that's again another disservice on them. And obviously with the Dragon of Courage, we have starter decks where they're not next to anything for you to actually upgrade. So like there's a lot to be desired when it comes to how Digimon and Bandai treats starter decks for this game. And like right now, EX sets seem like it's just the best way to actually start the game, which is very unfortunate because I want to point them to a direction that's better than that, because EX sets still have their own flaws, because EX sets in terms of power wise are not nearly as strong or meta relevant in terms of the actual decks that are coming out of it. So it's just like, oh, why am I picking up the set when most of this isn't meta relevant? Like, I know a lot of people are really high on Ragnarlordmon and Three Great Angels, but like they're rogue at best and still kind of hard to build and complete because you still need outside resources. And like it starts getting real messy. And that's where like Bandai's set design tries to pick up the slack because it's like, okay, you couldn't finish the builds the way you wanted to this set, so just wait for the next one. And that's how they try to get you to buy more, is to constantly have that feedback loop of introduce, upgrade, introduce, upgrade. And if they could apply that to some of their starter deck designs, I actually think we could be in a good spot for new players to be able to jump into the game. Because right now, all I can say is, you want to get into the game, wait until Liberators comes out. Like, that's probably the best place to start with, unless you just want to buy singles and feel comfortable with buying singles for a cheaper deck. So, you got any closing thoughts on starter decks or starter deck design or just starter products in general, Mark?
Oh, I think we covered a lot of ground, and I mean, it all really comes down to what what the game is built around, because each game I feel like is going to warrant a different kind of answer to what kind of starter product each game, the game needs. And obviously, you could look at it from the player perspective of, the players are going to want a decent variety of starter product to kind of get them into the game. And there could also, some games might have the argument of there's really no point in us having a lot of starter product. Some games might be like, we need an absolute crap ton of this starter product. And you could also look at it from the perspective of, like the business side of things of, okay, well, we put out 5 decks, but only 2 of them are really selling. Nobody's really buying the other 3, so why should we continue to put out, should we just drop it down to 2 decks instead of 5? It's it's definitely a tricky question to answer, and I feel like every game is going to have a slightly different answer. There's no one answer fits all for this kind of topic.
Yeah, because what I okay, so I'm actually going to change one of my answers previously. Um, what I actually would like to see Digimon do is, I like the idea of one starter deck each main booster set, to upgrade something that's going to be in that set. So that way they could constantly swap on what Digimon they want to do or support, or what characters being introduced in that set, so on and so forth. But what I actually would like them to do is kind of take the flesh and blood approach, where you literally just have like a big battle box. And you could call it whatever you want. But the idea is, this is where you'd have your 6 intro decks to try to upgrade, or to try to teach players how to play the game. So that way you buy this product, it's 6 decks, and each deck will obviously be doing something different mechanically, while also introducing each player to the core premise or premises of what the color is capable of. I do think, like, they kind of do get a little crazy when it comes to starter decks, in terms of like, oh, my starter deck is going to be about Grave Res, but it's going to set up its trash with either mill or discard, but for whatever reason, they'll just be like, yeah, this deck does both of them. So they'll make the decks unfocused, and I think like focusing the decks a little bit more, especially for that starter product, like the six deck super pack or whatever, to introduce players to the game, to give them a nice variety, wouldn't be a bad thing. And you don't have to make this crazy of a product. Probably just like maybe $40, 6 decks, or if you really wanted to, just make it even $60 for 6 decks. I like the $40 idea just because it's a more manageable price point. There's tons of board games that are $40, and you're basically kind of treating this like a board game. And it's just basically a battle set. Sure, you could upgrade it, but ideally you want to design it so that the decks are at least fair and balanced against each other, which Digimon starter decks have not been fair and balanced against each other. Because I've heard this question a lot, where it's just like, how does this and this starter deck face off against each other? And I'm like, well, it's not even close, my friend. This one is clearly better. It'll trounce this one by a long shot. So it's something that I know they'll never do, because they just, I don't know, it doesn't feel like something that they would do, but it would be something that I would like to see, is like that type of a product. So is there any, like, unique type of starter product that you would like to see just in a general sense? Like, what would get you to start a game and be really invested into it while also the idea of the product being slightly unique and interesting?
Well, I feel like I'd have to think about that. Give that one a fair bit of thought because I don't know. Like I said earlier, you don't want the starter product to be overly complicated, so you don't want to just drop 100-pound weight on the player at the very like get go and be like, okay, have fun, get learning, get good. But I like the idea of also having a starter product that is upgradable as the player kind of gets more comfortable with playing. And I don't know. I'd have to give it a fair bit of thought of something that's unique outside of just like, oh hey, here's a starter deck, or here's here's like a toolbox kind of like thing where it's like, here is the pre-constructed deck, here is here's essentially like 30 cards,
Yeah, because we've seen
and there's a
like
multitude of those 30 cards. Say there's like three different sets of 30 cards where it's like, oh hey, if you want to make this deck function more this direction, you can swap in cards from this pile. But if you want the deck to function more this direction, you want to put in stuff from this pile. And then you could also have the option of, you know what? You bought the product. If you want to go ham, you want to just start throwing random stuff from all the piles into the deck and just see what happens. You might find greatness. You might find disappointment.
yeah, almost like I know this is coming from like Pokemon and Magic, like a deck builder's toolkit thing, where it's just like, here's just a box of cards that you're able to start building something out of, like something more curated than a booster set, while still giving you the freedom to explore.
Yeah, kind of like a couple pre-constructed things, and then it's like, okay, also included are four like booster packs, so you'll also have whatever randomness you pull out of those on top of all of the base building blocks you need to actually put a deck together.
What I would actually like to do, this is to further expand on that idea, is to actually teach players how to build decks. Like that's a skill that I know is very intimidating for a lot of players. So literally you could combine that idea with the like, hey, this is how you kind of construct a base level deck. I know, like, just looking at Bandai's deck lists from the website for each of the sets, because they do release those, theirs is hot garbage. So I have very little confidence that they actually would be able to put something like that that's well thought out and constructed together. But, like, the idea is still kind of there, where it's like, yeah, here's just the toolbox, and then here's, like, a little pamphlet that says, like, this is kind of how you go about deck building. You got to think about these different things, and like it shows you each of the cards that are fitting like a particular role, or however they want to define it. I think that would be a cool expansion on that idea to actually teach deck building.
Well, I was gonna say, I don't know if they still do it, and I might be misremembering, but I feel like way, way back in the day, Pokemon did something like that, where your little like fold out playmat that, your basic playmat, like, hey, here's where your prizes go, here's where your bench is, active Pokemon, all that jazz. It felt like in some of like the starter decks, if you flipped that map over, it was basically like a quote unquote how to build a deck, and there was little like sections everywhere. It's like, okay, here is your energy pile, and for most decks you're kind of going to want to be shooting for about 16 to 20 energy, and here is your trainer pile, and this is how many trainers you should kind of be shooting for. Here's your pile for basic Pokemon,
Yeah,
you
like
should be going for this
basic.
many.
Yeah, basic ratios and like cards that would be upgrading from like the set, kind of like something to advertise the set a little bit. I do think Pokemon kind of did something. It's been a long time since I've touched like actual physical Pokemon cards, probably 20 years. Like I'm still sitting with my base set 1 Rain Dance deck. In case anyone's curious on how long it's been since I've actually played Pokemon. But I do remember something like that where it either helped give you a direction or it helped like give you more ideas on what you could do with it, because that was where I initially got the whole Rain Dance idea, was because this starter deck, I believe, was blue. It was either mono blue or blue purple, because Pokemon likes to mix colors in for their starter decks. But regardless of whatever it was, it gave me the idea, like it was either on the side of the box or somewhere, that like, hey, if you use this Blastoids, that's going to shift the dynamic of the deck in this direction because of what this card is doing. So I do think something like that was out there, and I do think Digimon could incorporate it because they're already trying to do that. It's just not in the best of ways, and that's kind of again why I really like the 1 starter deck per set, because that gives them more avenues to do that, because they could have that advertisement pamphlet inside of that starter product to basically do what they're saying on the website, which nobody really looks at. So, I mean, they look at it, but not like in the same capacity as having a pamphlet that they bought in front of them that's giving them ideas. Because,
Right.
the more casuals aren't going to go onto Bandai's main website for the card game to look all that stuff up. Like, they're just not. So having it in front of them and having it each set is a good constant way to further try to expand selling what you could to the players, while also making sure you'll always have a good entry and starting point.
Well, and the easiest way to do that, I think, is kind of like what Pokemon did, where it's just like, hey, here's your generalized ratio for a deck. And I mean, the ratios aren't always the same for every deck. With like Pokemon as an example, you could very easily put together decks that have only single evolution as its main focus. So you don't even have to worry about that,
Yeah,
you
or
know.
no evolution, just use all basics. And like Digimon has that same type of variety where not everything is going to try to go from egg to mega. And some decks will try to skip stages, some decks will just go straight from like mega in the hand to mega on the field. Like, yeah, but a good, like, depending on what the starter deck is and what they're trying to do, they could have those generalized ratios written out for the players to be able to further iterate on the deck themselves. And then obviously having, like you said before, different types of decks. Like, because that's one thing we don't really have is like all of our starter decks are basically just the same stack based deck, just done a little bit differently and then with their own little gimmick thrown in. And we haven't really had like that much actual deck style variety. We did have a couple, but not like anything that was like absolutely astronomically insane. Like what we have with like 7 Great Demon Lords as like a good clock or countdown deck that's basically Megazoo. I think that would be kind of neat, is actually showing different play styles and deck types. And then you can have different ratios for those different deck types. Again, that's getting a little bit too complicated and too over it, because I don't think Bandai even knows some of those things themselves. But just food for thought.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, you can come up with generalized ratios and teach the player like these are what you should shoot for. But as you know, you play around with decks and you do experimentation, it's all about playing with those ratios and finding interesting ways to make things work, you know. But if players have, those entry level players that are interested in building their own decks kind of have that starting point of, hey, you should be looking like about here on your ratios if you want to build your own deck. I think that would be a nice addition to include in like starter products.
Yeah. And like at the end of the day, the whole point of this discussion is just the fact that like some games do starter products pretty well, others don't. Digimon, unfortunately, I think is one of the games that doesn't do starter products very well. And there's definitely a lot of space for them to learn, grow, and develop on what they want their starter products to be. I liked the idea on one starter deck per set. I like the idea of having reprints inside of the starter decks on top of, like, obviously relevant cards that are going to be the driving force for the starter deck in terms of both generic staples and deck staples, because again, staples is something completely different in Digimon, because staple means something different to each of the different styles of play, because you have your like world staples where every deck can use it, and then you have like more deck specific staples where it's like, yeah, this is for all Agumon decks. If you're running an Agumon deck, obviously you would want to run this type of a card. So I think like having both levels of staples inside of the starter decks is good, and then obviously the higher the level of the starter deck, the more of those types of cards you'd include and make it even more enticing for players. That's just how I would go about changing Digimon to try to be more entry level friendly, because Digimon just isn't. That's the only unfortunate thing. And with the price of the game getting more and more expensive, because they figured out if they add more super rares in but don't give us actually more super rares, it makes super rares harder to get. And spoiler, that's currently where the game currently is headed, and why cards are retaining such insane prices on top of like the climbing price of like booster boxes themselves, which I don't know why EX6 is as expensive as it is. It realistically shouldn't be, because the supply is there, the demand is there, but it's I don't know. Digimon's just in a really weird spot, and I just want something to feel like we get a W as a community. And right now, it doesn't feel like we exactly have that W. So, and we're just taking it as it is. And there's nothing like insanely wrong with the way Digimon currently is being ran in terms of new player friendliness. It's just I want new players more often. And it's not like I'm not seeing new players more often. It's just, I don't know, figuring out a way to lower that barrier to make it even more accessible is something that I always would want out of any game. So I think that's a pretty good ending point, unless you have anything else you want to add, Mark.
No, I think we've covered pretty much everything I wanted to throw into the topic. So
Yeah, I always like doing these design topics with you, because you obviously have experience with a lot of games, as do I. So it gives us more avenues to not necessarily talk about those games, but use those games as a reference point to be able to take what they have done and learn from them. Because why should we make the same mistakes, or like why should companies make the same mistakes when the answer is literally right in front of them that somebody else has already did and figured out? It's just silly. I know Japan's like a really silly place in terms of like how they run things. They like to reinvent the wheel, but I don't know. I feel like they shouldn't have to reinvent the wheel.
sometimes people just want to make more work for themselves.
They do. But yeah, so I definitely liked this conversation, and I hope all of you listeners also enjoyed it and found this episode to be interesting and somewhat informative, the best that we can. And if you actually did enjoy this and want to help support the podcast, again, please feel free to leave all those social media doobly-doos, the likes, follows, subscribes, whatevers, on top of being able to share it with others on social media to be able to get it to actually spread. And I want to leave it at that, and thank you all again for listening all the way to the end, and we will see you next time.